The courtroom was eerily silent, save for the rustle of papers and the faint ticking of the wall clock. Judge Cassandra Hayes sat behind her imposing bench, her sharp gaze fixed on the couple seated before her. 8-year-old Elijah Coleman sat motionless in the front row, clutching a creased photograph, his small shoulders hunched under a sweater 2 sizes too big. The foster parents were detailing why they could no longer care for him, their words clinical and detached. Then it happened. Elijah stood abruptly, his voice cutting through the tense atmosphere like a blade. "You're my mom," he said, his eyes locking onto Cassandra's. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Cassandra froze, her composure faltering as her world tilted. Those 4 words carried a truth she couldn't ignore, a connection she couldn't explain. Unbeknownst to all, this moment would unravel a conspiracy that had stolen lives for decades.
Before we dive into today's story, we'd love your support. If you enjoy our content, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and leave a comment below sharing your thoughts. Your engagement helps us create more inspiring stories just for you. Now, without further ado, let's get started.
Judge Cassandra Hayes adjusted her glasses and scanned the thick file in front of her. At 43, she was one of the most respected judges in family court, known for her sharp mind and unwavering commitment to justice. Over her 15-year career, Cassandra had presided over countless cases involving broken families and neglected children. Yet something about this case gnawed at her. The name at the top of the file read, Elijah Coleman, age 8. The boy sat quietly in the front row, his small frame nearly swallowed by an oversized navy sweater. His head hung low, his hands gripping a worn photograph that seemed to anchor him to the world. Cassandra's sharp blue-gray eyes flicked to him momentarily, her mind lingering on the stark contrast between his silence and the liveliness she often saw in children his age. The foster parents, James and Patricia Olson, sat just a few feet away. Their polished appearance was striking. James in a tailored suit, and Patricia in a designer dress that matched her diamond bracelet. They exuded an air of practiced professionalism, but their words revealed a different story. "Your Honor," Patricia began, her tone calm but laced with exasperation. "We've done everything possible for Elijah. We enrolled him in therapy, hired tutors, and even set up a private room for him, complete with new furniture. But—" she paused dramatically, glancing at James for support. "He refuses to engage," James chimed in. "He doesn't participate in family activities, he won't speak, and when we try to include him, he stares at us as if we're the enemy." Cassandra folded her hands neatly on the bench. "Mrs. Olson, Mr. Olson, could you elaborate on the challenges you've faced?" Patricia sighed, her fingers fidgeting with the bracelet on her wrist. "The boy is difficult. He screams at night, has frequent outbursts, and refuses to trust us." She lowered her voice slightly, as if what she was about to say required delicacy. "We found him hiding in his closet last week, clutching that photograph. When we tried to comfort him, he became hysterical." Cassandra's gaze flickered back to Elijah. His fingers tightened around the photograph, and she noticed how his shoulders seemed to shrink inward at the mention of the incident. The sight tugged at something deep within her, a feeling she couldn't quite place. "Mr. and Mrs. Olson," Cassandra said evenly, though a hint of steel lined her voice. "Children who've experienced significant trauma often display behaviors that are not easily understood. Have you considered that Elijah's withdrawal might be a cry for help rather than defiance?" James bristled, straightening his tie. "With all due respect, Your Honor, we're experienced foster parents. We know when a child is simply refusing to cooperate. Elijah's presence disrupts the harmony of our home. It's not fair to our other foster children." Patricia nodded emphatically, her expression shifting into what Cassandra could only describe as a rehearsed look of concern. "We believe it's in Elijah's best interest to find a placement that can better meet his unique needs." Cassandra's jaw tightened. The Olsons spoke as if Elijah were an object to be returned, a defective product rather than a vulnerable child. For a moment, she was tempted to reprimand them, but she restrained herself. "Elijah," Cassandra said, her voice softening as she leaned slightly forward. "Would you like to share how you feel about all this?" The boy didn't move. His eyes remained fixed on the floor, his hands gripping the photograph so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The court-appointed social worker, Sarah Bennett, placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Elijah hasn't spoken much in recent weeks, Your Honor. The trauma specialist believes it's a protective response to his experiences in previous placements." Cassandra flipped through the file, her stomach tightening as she read the history. 7 foster homes in 8 years. Each placement terminated for reasons that sounded eerily similar: behavioral issues, failure to attach, difficulty adapting. "Elijah," Cassandra tried again, her tone even softer. "Can you tell me what's on your mind?" This time, the boy lifted his head slightly. Cassandra felt her breath hitch when their eyes met. There was something hauntingly familiar about them, dark, piercing, and filled with a sadness that seemed far too heavy for someone so young. The courtroom fell silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Then, to everyone's shock, Elijah rose to his feet. Sarah instinctively reached out to steady him, but the boy stepped forward, his movements slow and deliberate. He turned his gaze directly to Cassandra, his hands still clutching the photograph. His small voice, steady but filled with quiet conviction, echoed through the courtroom. "You're my mom." The words hung in the air like suspended crystals, clear and unshakable. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Patricia and James exchanged alarmed glances, their composed facades slipping for the first time. Sarah froze, her hand halfway extended toward Elijah. The bailiff shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting between the boy and the judge. Cassandra's composure, honed over years of presiding in court, wavered. Her grip tightened on the edge of her bench as she stared at Elijah, her mind struggling to process what she had just heard. "What did you say?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're my mom," Elijah repeated, louder this time. His eyes didn't waver, holding hers with a determination that sent a shiver down her spine. "I know you are." The courtroom erupted into murmurs. Cassandra glanced at the photograph in Elijah's hands, noticing for the first time the faint outline of a familiar face. Patricia's voice sliced through the commotion, her tone sharp with irritation. "Your Honor, this clearly demonstrates his instability. He's delusional." "Court is in recess," Cassandra managed to say, her voice trembling. She stood abruptly, gathering her robe around her like armor. "We will reconvene in 1 hour." As she retreated to her chambers, Cassandra felt the weight of Elijah's gaze following her. His words echoed in her mind, louder than the murmurs of the courtroom. "You're my mom." For the first time in her career, Cassandra Hayes wasn't sure she could maintain the professional distance her job demanded. Cassandra Hayes leaned back in her office chair, her hands trembling as she stared at the closed door. The murmurs from the courtroom had faded, leaving a tense silence that matched the storm brewing inside her mind. "You're my mom." Elijah's words echoed relentlessly, shaking the foundation of her carefully composed life. Cassandra's chambers, usually her sanctuary, felt suffocating. She turned her chair to face the large window overlooking the city skyline, her sharp blue-grey eyes now clouded with doubt. A judge's strength lay in logic, evidence, and impartiality, qualities she had honed over years of navigating family court's darkest cases. But this was something else entirely. She drew a shaky breath and reached for the cup of coffee on her desk. Her grip faltered, and the cup rattled against its saucer. 8 years. It had been 8 years since she had stood in a sterile hospital room, numb and hollow, as a nurse informed her that her newborn son hadn't survived the delivery. 8 years since she had signed the death certificate, unable to bring herself to look at the tiny, lifeless body the nurse insisted was too traumatic to see. 8 years since she had buried her grief under work and an unwavering commitment to protect other children, even as she failed to save her own. Your Honor? The soft knock startled her, pulling her from the abyss of memory. Sarah Bennett, the social worker assigned to Elijah's case, peeked into the room. May I come in? Cassandra straightened, regaining some semblance of composure. Yes, come in, Miss Bennett. Sarah entered cautiously, holding a file in one hand and resting her other hand on Elijah's shoulder. The boy followed her, clutching his photograph tightly. His eyes flicked to Cassandra with a mix of apprehension and determination that made her heart clench. Thank you, Miss Bennett, Cassandra said, her voice steadier than she felt. I'd like to speak with Elijah alone. Sarah hesitated, glancing at Elijah, who nodded slightly. I'll be right outside if you need me, she assured him, before stepping out and closing the door. Cassandra rose from her desk and gestured to the small seating area by the window. Come sit down, Elijah, she said gently. Elijah shuffled to the chair, his oversized sweater making him look even smaller. He perched on the edge, his hands never loosening their grip on the photograph. Cassandra sat across from him, her hands folded in her lap. She studied him closely, noting the dark circles under his eyes, the nervous way his fingers fidgeted with the edges of the worn photo, and the way his gaze darted around the room before finally settling on her. Can I see what you're holding? She asked softly. Elijah hesitated, then extended the photograph toward her with trembling hands. Cassandra took it carefully, her breath catching when she turned it over. The image was faded and creased, but the subject was unmistakable. A younger version of herself, seated in a hospital garden, her hand resting protectively over her pregnant belly. Her face glowed with anticipation, her smile full of hope. It was the last photo taken before her world had crumbled. Where did you get this? Cassandra asked, her voice barely above a whisper. A lady gave it to me, Elijah replied, his voice small but steady. Miss Jenny. She said she used to work at the hospital where I was born. She told me to keep it safe and that one day I'd find you. Cassandra's grip on the photograph tightened as memories flooded her mind. She remembered the nurse from that day, a woman with kind eyes who had seemed unusually insistent about keeping her calm. Cassandra hadn't thought much of it at the time, too consumed by grief to question anything. But now... Miss Jenny, Cassandra repeated, her mind racing. Do you remember her full name? Elijah shook his head. She said they fired her after she told me the truth. Cassandra leaned back in her chair, the photograph still in her hands. The edges of her carefully constructed world were beginning to fray. She had always prided herself on her ability to remain composed under pressure. But this was different. The resemblance between her and Elijah was undeniable. His dark eyes, the shape of his jaw, even the way his hands fidgeted, it was as if she were looking at a reflection of herself. Elijah, she said after a long pause. Do you remember anything else Miss Jenny told you? She said the hospital lied to you, he replied, his voice growing quieter. She said they told you I died, but they took me away instead. The room seemed to spin. Cassandra closed her eyes, gripping the photograph as if it were the only thing keeping her grounded. Could it be possible? Could the hospital, one of the most reputable in the state, have been involved in something so heinous? I'm going to ask you a very important question, Cassandra said, opening her eyes to meet Elijah's. Do you want to stay here with me for a little while? Just until we figure everything out? Elijah nodded without hesitation, his eyes filling with something Cassandra hadn't seen in him before: hope. She placed the photograph gently on her desk and stood, smoothing her robes. "All right then, let's get started." Cassandra's first call was to Marcus Chan, a private investigator she had worked with on several difficult cases. Marcus was thorough, relentless, and trusted by Cassandra for his ability to uncover even the most deeply buried truths. "I need your help, Marcus," she said, pacing her office. "This is personal." She explained the situation in careful detail, her voice steady, despite the storm of emotions brewing within her. "This is heavy, Cassandra," Marcus said after a long silence. "If what you're saying is true, we're looking at something much bigger than a mix-up. This could be a criminal operation." "I know," Cassandra replied. "That's why I need you. Start with Riverside Memorial Hospital. I want every record, every piece of evidence you can find about their maternity ward 8 years ago." "Understood. I'll get on it right away." Next, Cassandra called Sarah Bennett back into the room. The social worker's eyes widened slightly when she saw the photograph on the desk. "Miss Bennett, I need you to pull every file you have on Elijah's foster placements," Cassandra said. "I also need to know everything about the agency that handled his case, New Horizon Family Services." Sarah hesitated. "Your Honor, do you think—" "I don't know what to think," Cassandra admitted. "But I'm going to find out." That night, after Elijah had fallen asleep in the guest room of her home, Cassandra sat alone at her desk, staring at the photograph. Her fingers traced the edges as she replayed the events of the day in her mind. What if he's really my son? The question refused to leave her thoughts. It felt impossible, and yet something deep within her, a mother's intuition perhaps, whispered that it might be true. As the clock ticked past midnight, Cassandra made a silent vow. She would uncover the truth, no matter how painful or complicated it might be. Elijah deserved answers, and so did she. The morning sun streamed through Cassandra Hayes's kitchen window as she poured herself a strong cup of coffee. Despite the warmth of the sunlight, a chill lingered in her chest. The photograph Elijah had handed her the day before now sat prominently on the counter, a constant reminder of the questions she needed to answer. Sarah Bennett sat across the table, flipping through a thick stack of files she had retrieved from the county's child welfare office. The social worker's brow was furrowed as she jotted notes, occasionally shaking her head in frustration. 7 foster homes in 8 years, Sarah muttered, each placement ending with the same vague explanation: behavioral issues or failure to adapt. But look at this. She slid a page toward Cassandra. The paperwork for his initial placement is incomplete. No birth certificate, no hospital records, just a transfer form from New Horizon Family Services. Cassandra picked up the document, her legal mind immediately noting the inconsistencies. This form isn't standard. It's missing signatures, dates, even the name of the social worker who handled the case. Sarah nodded grimly. And it gets worse. New Horizon shut down 5 years ago, after reports of financial irregularities. All their case files were seized, but many of them went missing during the investigation. Whatever they were doing, they covered their tracks well. Before Cassandra could respond, her phone buzzed. It was Marcus Chan. She put the call on speaker. "I've got some preliminary findings," Marcus said. "Riverside Memorial's maternity ward records from 8 years ago are a mess. Whole sections are missing or redacted. But I found something interesting. There was a nurse named Jennifer Kirk who worked there during that time. She left the hospital abruptly a few months after your son's supposed death." Cassandra's breath hitched. "Jenny? Elijah mentioned a Miss Jenny. Do you have any idea where she is now?" She's living under the radar in a small town in Oregon, Marcus replied. I tracked her down through some old employment records. When I called, she didn't seem surprised to hear your name. Cassandra exchanged a glance with Sarah. What did she say? She wants to talk, Marcus said. Said she has information you need. Cassandra's pulse quickened. Can you arrange a meeting? She's hesitant about traveling, but she agreed to a video call. I'll set it up for this afternoon. Hours later, Cassandra sat in her study, her laptop open and ready for the call. Elijah was upstairs, under Sarah's watchful eye, drawing pictures in a notebook she had given him. Cassandra's fingers tapped nervously on the desk as the screen flickered to life. A woman in her mid-50s appeared on the screen, her silver hair neatly pulled back. Her face was lined with years of weariness, but her eyes held a quiet strength. Cassandra recognized her immediately, Jenny Kirk. Judge Hayes, Jenny began, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. I've waited a long time to speak with you. Cassandra leaned forward. Ms. Kirk, please call me Cassandra, and thank you for agreeing to this. I need to know everything you can tell me. Jenny nodded. 8 years ago, I was a labor and delivery nurse at Riverside Memorial. I loved my job, but there were things happening at that hospital, things I couldn't ignore. Things like what? Cassandra prompted. Jenny hesitated, then took a deep breath. There was a baby trafficking operation running out of the maternity ward. They targeted single mothers, especially those who were vulnerable, women with difficult pregnancies, no family support, or financial struggles. They'd create crises, claim the baby didn't survive, and then funnel the child into illegal adoptions through agencies like New Horizon. Cassandra's stomach churned. How did they get away with it? They had people everywhere, Jenny explained. Doctors, administrators, even social workers. They falsified death certificates, fabricated adoption papers, and ensured the mothers were too overwhelmed or sedated to question anything. Jenny's voice wavered as she continued. I was there the day you gave birth, Cassandra. I remember it vividly because it didn't sit right with me. They told you your baby was stillborn, but I saw him. He was healthy, crying, kicking. They took him away before you even woke up. The room seemed to tilt. Cassandra gripped the edge of her desk, her knuckles white. Why didn't you say anything? I tried, Jenny said, her voice breaking. I confronted Dr. Thomas Wells, the head of the maternity ward, but he told me to stay out of it. Said I'd lose my job if I didn't. When I kept pushing, they fired me anyway and blacklisted me from working in any hospital in the state. Cassandra's mind raced, piecing together the puzzle. And Elijah? Jenny's eyes softened. I didn't know where he ended up until years later. When I started fostering, he was placed in my care for a few months. That's when I recognized him. I gave him the photograph of you and told him the truth as much as I could, without putting him in danger. But they found out, and the next day, they removed him from my home. Tears blurred Cassandra's vision as she processed Jenny's words. Do you have any proof of what you're saying? Jenny nodded and held up a USB drive. I kept records, copies of falsified documents, photographs, even audio recordings of conversations with Dr. Wells. I've been waiting for someone like you to come along, someone who could do something with this. Cassandra's voice trembled. Why didn't you come forward sooner? Jenny looked down, her shoulders sagging. Fear. I was afraid they'd come after me, or worse, Elijah. But when I saw him in your courtroom on the news, I knew it was time. By the time the call ended, Cassandra's mind was racing. She called Marcus immediately, relaying everything Jenny had said. We need to move fast, she told him. I don't know how deep this goes, but I'm not stopping until I expose every single person involved. Marcus's voice was calm but determined. I'll dig into Dr. Wells and New Horizon, and I'll make arrangements to get Jenny's evidence into the right hands. Cassandra hung up and sat in silence, the photograph of her younger self still on her desk. For the first time in years, the grief she had buried so deeply began to shift, replaced by a fierce determination. This wasn't just about Elijah. It was about every mother who had been lied to, every child who had been stolen, and every family that had been shattered by greed. Upstairs, she heard Elijah's laughter, a sound she had never expected to hear in her home. It was a reminder of what was at stake, and why she couldn't give up. "Mom?" Elijah's voice called softly from the doorway. Cassandra turned to see him standing there, clutching a new drawing. He held it out to her, and she took it with a smile. The picture showed two stick figures, a woman and a boy, holding hands under a bright sun. Above them, in wobbly letters, he had written, "Me and my mom." Cassandra knelt down and pulled him into a gentle hug. "It's beautiful, Elijah. Just like you." And in that moment she knew she would do whatever it took to protect him and uncover the truth. Cassandra Hayes sat in her chambers, staring at the manila envelope on her desk, as though it might explode. Her name and Elijah's were scrawled across the front in bold black letters. Inside lay the results of the DNA test, answers to the question that had consumed her since Elijah's declaration in the courtroom. Was he really her son? The knock at her door startled her, and Sarah Bennett peeked in. "Are you ready?" she asked gently, holding a steaming cup of tea. "As ready as I'll ever be," Cassandra replied, her voice trembling slightly. Sarah entered and sat beside her, placing the tea on the desk. Cassandra hesitated for a moment longer, then ripped open the envelope. Her eyes scanned the document, landing on the conclusion. Probability of maternity, 99.99%. Her breath caught. A wave of relief, disbelief, and raw emotion washed over her. She leaned back in her chair, pressing a hand to her mouth. "He's my son," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Elijah is my son." Sarah smiled softly, her eyes glistening. "I knew it the moment I saw the two of you together. There's something about the way he looks at you." Later that afternoon, Cassandra met with Marcus Chan and Jenny Kirk in her study. Jenny had travelled to Cassandra's home to hand-deliver her evidence, files, photographs, and recordings she had meticulously gathered during her years at Riverside Memorial. "This," Marcus said, holding up a USB drive, "is a treasure trove of incriminating evidence. If we use it right, we can blow this whole operation wide open." Jenny nodded. "It's not just about Elijah. There are dozens, maybe even hundreds of children who were stolen the same way he was." Cassandra felt a lump form in her throat as she flipped through the documents Jenny had provided. The names of other mothers were listed alongside falsified death certificates, with notes detailing the circumstances under which their babies had been taken. Some were marked as high priority, due to the mother's education or health, factors that made their children more desirable to prospective adoptive families, willing to pay exorbitant fees. "This is monstrous," Cassandra said, her voice shaking with anger. "They targeted women who were vulnerable and alone, then preyed on their grief." Jenny's hands trembled as she picked up a photograph from the pile. It showed a group of doctors and nurses, including Dr. Thomas Wells, smiling outside the maternity ward. "He's the mastermind," she said, her tone bitter. "Dr. Wells orchestrated everything. He decided which mothers to target and coordinated with New Horizon Family Services to place the babies." Marcus leaned forward, his face grim. "New Horizon wasn't just an adoption agency. It was a front for trafficking. They laundered money through fake donations and funneled it to hospital administrators, doctors, and even some judges who expedited the adoption process." Cassandra's heart sank as she processed the magnitude of what they were uncovering. "Judges? Do we have names?" Marcus nodded. "Several. I've started digging into their financial records, and there are clear patterns of bribery and corruption. It's a network that spans multiple states. Over the next few days, Cassandra and her team worked tirelessly to piece together the evidence. Marcus traced financial transactions linking New Horizon to offshore accounts, while Sarah combed through Elijah's foster care records, finding more discrepancies with each passing hour. Jenny's recordings revealed chilling conversations between Dr. Wells and hospital administrators discussing inventory and high-value clients, as though they were dealing with products, not children. One recording in particular struck a nerve with Cassandra. It captured Dr. Wells speaking to a prospective adoptive couple. "The mother is a judge," he said, his tone casual. "Educated, healthy, no history of genetic disorders. The baby's worth every penny." Cassandra's hands shook as she listened. The betrayal cut deep, deeper than she had thought possible. She had trusted the medical professionals at Riverside Memorial to care for her during one of the most vulnerable moments of her life. Instead, they had stolen her child and sold him like a commodity. "How many other mothers went through this?" Cassandra asked, her voice tight. Jenny sighed. "I documented 30 cases during my time there, but I'm sure there were more. New Horizon worked with other hospitals too." Sarah entered the room, holding a stack of papers. "I cross-referenced the names in Jenny's files with the foster care system. Many of these children ended up in homes that were later flagged for abuse or neglect. The trauma they've endured is unimaginable." Cassandra's jaw tightened. "We need to act now. This can't wait." The following morning, Cassandra contacted the district attorney, who immediately involved federal authorities. Within hours, the FBI was coordinating a task force to investigate the allegations. Marcus provided them with a detailed report of the financial trail, while Jenny handed over her recordings and documents. Agents raided the offices of New Horizon Family Services and Riverside Memorial Hospital, seizing computers, records, and communications. Dr. Wells was arrested at his home, where investigators discovered more evidence: hidden files, forged documents, and a ledger detailing the sale of over 50 babies. The media quickly caught wind of the story, and headlines exploded across the country. "Hospital trafficking ring uncovered. Babies sold to wealthy families." News outlets described the network's reach, implicating doctors, adoption agencies, and even high-ranking officials. For Cassandra, the media attention was both a blessing and a burden. It brought awareness to the issue, but it also painted a target on her back. As the face of the investigation, she received both praise and backlash. Some questioned her objectivity, while others accused her of exploiting the situation for personal gain. Through it all, Elijah remained her anchor. His presence reminded her of what she was fighting for, not just justice for herself, but for every mother and child who had been torn apart by this corrupt system. One evening, as Cassandra reviewed the latest reports in her study, Elijah walked in, clutching the same photograph he had carried since their first meeting. "Mom," he said softly. She looked up, her heart warming at the word. It still felt surreal to hear him call her that. "What is it, sweetheart?" she asked. "Are the bad people going to jail?" he asked, his voice tinged with worry. "Yes," Cassandra assured him, pulling him into her lap. "The bad people are going to jail, and they won't hurt anyone else ever again." Elijah rested his head on her shoulder, his small hand clutching the photograph. "I'm glad you found me." Cassandra kissed the top of his head, tears pricking her eyes. "I'm glad too, and I promise, no one will ever take you away from me again." As the weeks passed, the scope of the investigation continued to grow. The FBI uncovered ties between New Horizon and similar organizations in other states, revealing a sprawling network that had operated for decades. Hospitals, adoption agencies, and even politicians were implicated, their roles varying from active participation to willful ignorance. The task force also began reaching out to other mothers whose names appeared in Jenny's files. Cassandra joined some of these meetings, offering support and guidance to women who had spent years mourning children they thought were dead. One such mother, Grace Ramirez, broke down sobbing as she held her teenage daughter for the first time since her supposed stillbirth. "I never stopped hoping," Grace said through her tears, "but I didn't think I'd ever see her again." Cassandra's resolve strengthened with each reunion. Every mother who found her child, every child who returned to their family, was a victory against the corruption that had caused so much pain. By the end of the month, over 100 children had been identified as victims of the trafficking ring. Many were reunited with their biological families, while others were placed in supportive homes as investigations continued. Dr. Wells faced a litany of charges, including kidnapping, human trafficking, and conspiracy. His arrest sent shockwaves through the medical community, prompting reviews of hospital policies nationwide. For Cassandra, the fight was far from over. The legal battles would be long and grueling, and there were still countless children to find. But as she tucked Elijah into bed one night, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. The boy who had once been a stranger in her courtroom was now her son, her light in the darkness. And together, they were proving that even in the face of unimaginable betrayal, love and justice could prevail. The courtroom was silent, save for the shuffling of papers and the low hum of tension in the air. Cassandra Hayes stood at the podium, facing the panel of attorneys and investigators leading the federal case. Her voice was steady, her resolve unshakable, as she presented her findings and recommendations. "This network has operated in the shadows for decades," she said, her tone sharp with controlled anger. "Doctors, administrators, adoption agencies, and even members of our judiciary profited off the trafficking of innocent children. It's not just criminal, it's an abhorrent betrayal of trust." The evidence, gathered with painstaking detail by Marcus Chan and Jenny Kirk, was overwhelming. It outlined the scheme's operations, from the falsified death certificates to the forged adoption papers and the money trails that implicated dozens of high-ranking officials. Cassandra had spent weeks working with the FBI task force to ensure every piece of evidence was airtight. Across the table, the district attorney, Linda Carlton, nodded grimly. "Your work has been instrumental, Judge Hayes, but I have to ask, are you prepared for what's coming? The people we're about to prosecute are powerful. They won't go down without a fight." Cassandra met her gaze, her chin lifting slightly. "I didn't come this far to stop now. These families deserve justice, and I'll do whatever it takes to make sure they get it." The first wave of arrests began 2 days later. Dr. Thomas Wells was taken into custody at his gated estate, flanked by FBI agents. The footage of his arrest played on every major news network, showing him in handcuffs, shielding his face from the cameras. As the investigation deepened, more names surfaced: hospital administrators, social workers, lawyers, and even judges who had facilitated the illegal adoptions. Cassandra felt a grim satisfaction each time a new warrant was issued. These were people who had hidden behind their titles and wealth, preying on the vulnerable for their own gain. But the public response was far from unanimous. While many praised Cassandra for her courage and dedication, others accused her of bias and using the case for personal attention. Social media buzzed with debates, some supportive, others cruel. One headline in particular stung: "Judge Hayes, hero or opportunist?" The backlash was not unexpected, but it wore on Cassandra nonetheless. Every time she opened her email, there were threats and vitriol mixed in with messages of gratitude. Some claimed she was exaggerating the extent of the trafficking network, while others accused her of focusing on this case only because it involved her own son. "I don't care what they say," Cassandra told Sarah one evening, her voice resolute. "Let them question my motives. The evidence speaks for itself." At home, the bond between Cassandra and Elijah was slowly but surely growing. The boy who had once been wary and withdrawn now followed her around the house, asking questions and sharing small glimpses into his thoughts. One evening, while they sat together in the living room, Elijah clutched a stuffed lion Cassandra had given him and hesitated before speaking. "Mom," he said softly, the words still new and tentative. "Can I tell you something?" "Of course, sweetheart," Cassandra replied, setting down the legal briefs she had been reviewing. "You can tell me anything." Elijah's small hands fidgeted with the lion's mane as he spoke. "In one of the houses, the foster houses, they had a basement." Cassandra felt her stomach tighten. She forced herself to remain calm, knowing this moment was important. "What happened in the basement?" she asked gently. "They put me there when I cried," Elijah said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They said I had to stay there until I stopped being bad." Cassandra's chest ached as she listened. She reached out, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. "That wasn't your fault, Elijah. You were never bad. What they did to you was wrong." Elijah looked up at her, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "Do you think I'll ever forget it?" Cassandra's throat tightened, but she managed to keep her voice steady. "You might not forget, but it doesn't have to hurt forever. We'll work through it together. You're safe now, and no one will ever hurt you like that again." He nodded slowly, leaning into her side. It was a small step, but to Cassandra it felt monumental. He was beginning to trust her, to believe in the safety and stability she promised. Meanwhile, the case against Dr. Wells and his co-conspirators gained traction. Jenny's evidence, combined with Marcus's investigative work, provided a damning portrait of the network's operations. Prosecutors built their case methodically, ensuring every charge, from kidnapping to human trafficking, was backed by irrefutable proof. The media frenzy intensified as more details emerged. One story after another highlighted the horrific experiences of children who had been placed in abusive foster homes or bounced between placements like Elijah. Mothers who had believed their babies were dead came forward, sharing their grief and outrage. Cassandra attended some of the support meetings organized by the task force. Sitting among these women, she felt a deep sense of solidarity and sorrow. Each story was unique, but the pain was universal. "I always knew something didn't add up," one mother, Lauren Harris, said through tears. "But they made me feel crazy for questioning it." "You're not crazy," Cassandra assured her. "You were lied to, just like the rest of us. But now we have the truth, and we're going to hold them accountable." Despite the mounting victories, Cassandra's resolve was tested when Dr. Wells' defense team launched a smear campaign against her. They claimed her involvement in the case was a conflict of interest, accusing her of using her position as a judge to influence the investigation. Marcus was livid. "They're trying to discredit you, because they know how strong the case is." "I don't care what they say about me," Cassandra said firmly. "This isn't about me. It's about Elijah and every other child they stole." Still, the attacks took a toll. Late at night, after Elijah was asleep, Cassandra would sit in her study, poring over files and replaying Jenny's recordings, searching for any detail that might strengthen the case. Her exhaustion was evident, but her determination never wavered. One night, Elijah came downstairs, rubbing his eyes sleepily. "Why are you still awake?" he asked, climbing onto her lap. Cassandra smiled, brushing a hand through his curls. "Just working on the case. Go back to bed, sweetheart." Elijah frowned, his small face serious. "Do you think the bad people are sorry?" Cassandra paused, caught off guard by the question. "I don't know," she admitted. "Some of them might be, but being sorry doesn't erase what they did." Elijah nodded thoughtfully. "I hope they know how it feels to be scared." Cassandra hugged him tightly, her heart aching for the pain he carried. "No one should ever make you feel scared again, Elijah. That's why we're doing this, to make sure they can't hurt anyone else." As the weeks went on, the arrests continued. The network's reach was broader than anyone had anticipated, with ties to hospitals, adoption agencies, and even politicians. Cassandra worked closely with the task force, helping to review cases and provide support for affected families. Through it all, Elijah remained her greatest motivator. His laughter, his growing sense of security, and the trust he was beginning to place in her were reminders of why she had to keep fighting. One afternoon, as they sat on the porch together, Elijah turned to her and said, "I don't remember everything, but I remember your song." "My song?" Cassandra asked, confused. "The one you sang when I was in your tummy," Elijah said, his voice soft but certain. "Miss Jenny said you sang it all the time." Tears welled in Cassandra's eyes as she realized what he meant. Without thinking, she began to hum the lullaby her mother had sung to her as a child, the same one she had sung to her unborn son. Elijah's face lit up with recognition, and he hummed along, his small voice blending with hers. The house felt warmer now. Cassandra Hayes couldn't quite explain it, but since Elijah had moved in, the space seemed to come alive. The quiet echoes of an empty home had been replaced with the sound of laughter, the occasional thud of little feet, and the hum of conversation. She watched from the doorway as Elijah carefully arranged books on the shelves in his new room. His small hands moved with purpose, lining up the spines so they were perfectly straight. A stuffed lion, his constant companion, sat proudly on the bed, surrounded by soft blankets Cassandra had picked out with him at the store. "Do you like it?" she asked softly, stepping into the room. Elijah turned, his face lighting up with a smile that made Cassandra's heart swell. "It's perfect," he said, nodding earnestly. "Thank you, Mom." She froze for a moment, her chest tightening at the sound of that word. "Mom." It was still so new, so precious. She stepped forward and crouched to his level. "You're welcome, sweetheart. This is your home now. You can make it however you want." Elijah's face grew thoughtful. "It feels safe here," he said after a moment. "I didn't feel safe before, in the other houses." Cassandra reached out and gently cupped his cheek. "You're safe now. No one will ever hurt you again. I promise." The first few days were a whirlwind of adjustments. Cassandra made sure Elijah's transition was as smooth as possible, from setting up a predictable routine to ensuring his favorite snacks were always stocked in the kitchen. She reached out to a trauma-informed therapist, Dr. Emily Carter, who specialized in helping children like Elijah. Their first session was promising. Elijah was hesitant but willing to talk, and Cassandra could see the beginnings of trust forming. At night, Elijah's nightmares sometimes returned, pulling him from sleep with gasping breaths and wide, frightened eyes. Each time, Cassandra was there, holding him close, humming the lullaby he had remembered from the womb. The soft melody seemed to calm him, his small body relaxing against hers as he drifted back to sleep. During the day, Elijah's resilience shone. He approached everything with cautious determination, learning how to ride a bike, helping Cassandra bake cookies, even planting flowers in the backyard garden. Watching him bloom, little by little, filled Cassandra with both pride and sorrow. She couldn't change the years he had lost, but she could make sure the ones ahead were filled with love and security. One afternoon, as they sat on the porch swing, Elijah turned to her with a curious expression. "Did you always want to be a judge?" he asked. Cassandra smiled, wrapping an arm around him. "I did. When I was a little girl, I wanted to help people. I thought being a judge would let me do that." "Do you still like it?" he asked, tilting his head. "I do," she said, her voice softening. "But I think this case, your case, has shown me that there are other ways to help people. Families like ours need someone to fight for them, and I want to keep doing that." Elijah nodded thoughtfully. "I think you're a superhero," he said, matter of fact. Cassandra laughed, pulling him close. "You know what? I think you're the superhero, Elijah. You're the bravest person I know." As the weeks turned into months, Elijah began to settle into his new life. He made friends at his new school, where teachers were trained to work with children who had experienced trauma. He joined an art class and brought home drawings that filled the refrigerator. Slowly but surely, he began to open up about his past. One evening, as they sat together reading a bedtime story, Elijah rested his head on Cassandra's shoulder. "I didn't think anyone would ever come for me," he admitted quietly. "Sometimes I thought maybe I didn't deserve it." Cassandra's heart ached. She turned to face him, her voice firm but gentle. "Elijah, listen to me. None of what happened to you was your fault. You've always deserved love and safety. And I'm so sorry it took me this long to find you, but I'm here now, and I'm never letting you go." Elijah looked up at her, his dark eyes filled with a mixture of hope and vulnerability. "You really mean it?" "More than anything," Cassandra said, pulling him into a tight hug. "You're my son, Elijah. Nothing will ever change that." Their bond grew stronger with each passing day, and Cassandra found herself drawing strength from Elijah's resilience. He was a living testament to the power of hope, even in the face of unimaginable pain. His journey inspired her to keep pushing forward, not just for him, but for every child and mother impacted by the trafficking network. With the help of the task force, Cassandra began organizing support groups for families affected by the scandal. She reached out to other mothers whose children had been stolen, offering them a listening ear and a safe space to share their grief and anger. She worked with therapists and legal advocates to ensure these families had the resources they needed to heal. Elijah often accompanied her to these meetings, his presence a source of comfort for the other children. He would sit quietly with them, sharing crayons or trading stories, his calm demeanor encouraging them to open up. Cassandra marveled at his ability to connect with others, even after everything he had endured. "You're making a difference," she told him one day as they drove home from a meeting. Elijah shrugged, a small smile playing on his lips. "I just don't want anyone else to feel the way I did." One evening, as they sat together under the stars in their backyard, Cassandra found herself reflecting on how far they had come. The boy who had once been a stranger in her courtroom was now her son in every sense of the word. She had spent years grieving his loss, but now she was determined to cherish every moment they had together. Elijah leaned against her, his head resting on her shoulder. "Do you think we'll find all the other kids?" he asked, his voice soft. "I don't know," Cassandra admitted, "but we're going to try. As long as there are families out there waiting to be reunited, we'll keep fighting." Elijah nodded, his gaze fixed on the sky. "I'm glad you didn't give up," he said after a moment. Cassandra smiled, her heart full. "I'm glad you didn't give up, Elijah. You're the reason we're here." As the stars twinkled above them, Cassandra felt a deep sense of peace. The road ahead would be long and challenging, but she knew they would face it together. Elijah had given her a new purpose, and she would honor it by continuing to fight for justice, for him, for herself, and for every family still searching for their miracle. The courtroom was packed to capacity. Reporters lined the back walls, cameras poised to capture every moment of the trial's conclusion. Cassandra Hayes sat with her hands folded on the wooden table before her, her expression calm but resolute. Beside her sat Sarah Bennett, whose dedication had been instrumental in unraveling the vast web of corruption they had uncovered. Across the room, Dr. Thomas Wells sat slumped in his chair, his once pristine appearance replaced by the weary demeanor of a man who had run out of excuses. The charges against him, human trafficking, fraud, conspiracy, and falsification of medical records, had been laid out in excruciating detail over the course of the trial. Witness after witness had testified, recounting the horrors of what he and his accomplices had done. The judge's voice echoed through the courtroom as she delivered the sentence. "Dr. Thomas Wells, you are hereby sentenced to 25 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole." A murmur rippled through the room, followed by a wave of applause from the audience. Cassandra exhaled, her chest tightening with relief. It wasn't just about Wells. It was about justice for every family he had torn apart. His conviction marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. The arrests continued to ripple through the network. Hospital administrators, adoption agency executives, and even judges and social workers who had facilitated the trafficking scheme were taken into custody. The FBI's task force, bolstered by the evidence provided by Marcus Chan and Jenny Kirk, worked tirelessly to ensure no stone was left unturned. Cassandra had taken on a new role as an advocate for the affected families. No longer confined to the bench, she poured her energy into organizing resources, support groups, and legal aid for those who had been victimized by the scheme. Her focus wasn't just on bringing the perpetrators to justice, it was on helping families heal. "Reuniting these children with their parents is just the beginning," she said during a press conference. "These families need ongoing support to process their grief, rebuild trust, and navigate the challenges of starting over." One of her proudest moments came when she stood alongside Sarah at the launch of the Reunited Families Network, an initiative dedicated to connecting mothers and children separated by the trafficking ring. The program provided DNA testing, counseling, and advocacy, ensuring no family was left without a path to reunion. At home, Elijah was thriving. The quiet, withdrawn boy Cassandra had first met in her courtroom had transformed into a confident, curious child. His laughter filled the house, and his artwork decorated every available surface. He had made friends at school, joined a soccer team, and even started writing a story about a superhero judge who saved children from villains. One evening, as Cassandra was tucking him into bed, Elijah looked up at her with a thoughtful expression. "Do you think the other kids are happy now? The ones who found their families?" "I think so," Cassandra replied, smoothing his blanket. "But it's not always easy. It takes time for everyone to adjust. That's why we're helping them." Elijah nodded. "I want to help too. Can I tell my story at the meeting tomorrow?" Cassandra's heart swelled with pride. "Of course you can, sweetheart. Your story is important. It's helped so many people already." The next day, Cassandra and Elijah attended the National Convention for Reunited Families, a gathering of parents, children, advocates, and law enforcement officials who had worked together to dismantle the trafficking network. The convention was held in a sprawling conference center filled with booths offering resources and workshops on trauma recovery, legal rights, and systemic reform. Elijah walked confidently into the room, holding Cassandra's hand. He spotted Sophie, a girl he had befriended through the support group, and ran over to greet her. The two children had an unspoken bond, their shared experiences bringing them closer than most friends. As the afternoon session began, Cassandra took the stage to deliver a speech. The room fell silent as she began. "A little over a year ago, my son stood up in a courtroom and said 4 words that changed my life. 'You're my mom.' Those words set off a chain of events that uncovered one of the largest child trafficking rings in this country's history. But more importantly, they brought us back to each other." She paused, scanning the audience. Many were nodding, their expressions reflecting the deep understanding that only came from shared experience. "Today, we celebrate not just the justice that has been served, but the resilience and courage of every family here. Each of you has faced unimaginable pain, yet you've chosen to fight for the truth. Together, we've proven that love and determination can overcome even the darkest of betrayals." The room erupted into applause as Cassandra stepped back from the podium. Elijah joined her on stage, his small hand slipping into hers. He looked out at the crowd, his voice steady as he spoke into the microphone. "When I found my mom, I thought I was the only one," he said. "But now I know there are so many kids like me, and so many moms who never stopped looking for their kids. I just want to say, don't give up. Even if it feels impossible, Miracles can happen. Tears filled Cassandra's eyes as the audience rose to their feet, clapping and cheering. Elijah's bravery had once again inspired hope in everyone around him. After the convention, Cassandra and Elijah joined a group of families for a candlelight vigil. Standing in a circle, each family held a small candle, their flames flickering in the evening breeze. Cassandra held Elijah close as the group observed a moment of silence for those still searching for their loved ones. As the candles were extinguished, Cassandra looked down at her son, his face illuminated by the glow of the remaining light. "You're my miracle," she whispered, kissing the top of his head. "And you're mine," Elijah replied, his voice full of quiet certainty. The following morning, Cassandra sat on the porch of their home, sipping coffee, as Elijah played in the yard with Sophie and a few other children from the support group. Their laughter echoed through the crisp morning air, a reminder of how far they had come. Her phone buzzed with a message from Marcus. Another family match confirmed. "That makes 15 this week. Keep pushing, Cassandra. We're making a difference." She smiled, her resolve strengthened. There was still so much work to be done, but each reunion was a step closer to healing the wounds left by the trafficking ring. Cassandra had found her purpose, not just as a mother, but as an advocate for every family torn apart by greed and corruption. As she watched Elijah chase a soccer ball across the grass, his laughter ringing out like music, Cassandra knew the fight had been worth it. Love had brought them back to each other, and now it was leading the way for countless others. In the end, the greatest victory wasn't just the justice that had been served, it was the hope that had been restored. For Cassandra and Elijah, and for every family still searching, the message was clear. Miracles were possible, and love could conquer even the darkest of betrayals.